The sound of silverware hitting plates mingled with the strong smell of roast chicken. Everything seemed normal until my mother, without looking up from her plate, said, "You no longer belong in this family." She chewed calmly, as if she hadn't just ripped the ground out from under my feet. The surrounding noise faded, and for a few seconds all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I felt my stomach tighten, but I couldn't say anything. Share this story to reach more people, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. I'll be thrilled to read every comment. My fingers gripped my fork so tightly I feared it would bend. My father continued eating, avoiding my eyes. My sister across the table looked uncomfortable but didn't say a word. It was as if everyone knew this sentence had been prepared long before I sat down. I looked at my mother, expecting her to say it was a bad joke, but there was no smile, no regret in her eyes, just the coldness of someone who believes they have the right to decide where you belong. The taste of the food completely drained from my mouth. I was no longer present at that table. Not really. With each bite, I felt like I was being pushed out, with no way back. The rest of lunch was a silent torture. The sound of the knife cutting through the meat, the glass of water being placed on the table, the sound of the plate being scraped, everything seemed amplified. I tried to understand what had happened to get me to this point, but the pieces didn't fit together. I looked around, searching for any sign of support. My sister avoided my eyes. My father stood motionless, almost mechanical. And my mother seemed to be somewhere else, as if I were already a stranger sitting at the table. The feeling of exclusion was so physical I could barely breathe. I swallowed hard, and memories began to flood my mind. Small frictions, interrupted conversations, hard looks from the past few months. It was as if I were connecting dots that had previously seemed unconnected. Now everything made sense, or maybe too much sense. When lunch was over, no one told me to stay. No goodbyes, no touches on the shoulder, just the sound of chairs scraping and footsteps moving in different directions. I remained seated for a few seconds, trying to regain control of my trembling hands. It was at that moment that I realized that sentence hadn't been said in the heat of the moment. It was a decision, and decisions like that aren't easily undone. Leaving the table, I walked up to my room with slow steps, as if each step were harder to reach than the last. The closed door behind me muffled the sounds of the house, but it didn't silence the phrase that echoed endlessly in my head. "You don't belong in this family anymore." It was impossible not to think of everything we'd experienced together, the childhood memories, the laughter we once shared that now seemed to come from a life that didn't belong to me. I remembered nights when my mother would comfort me after a nightmare, the way she'd hold my hand when I was afraid of the dark. And now, the same mouth that spoke comforting words could shut me out with an almost cruel calm. The contrast hurt, as if the image I'd had of her were shattering before my eyes. Piece by piece, recent arguments began to line up like a predictable script. The day I questioned certain family decisions, the night I came home late and heard snide comments, the argument over choices that didn't please everyone, small cracks that, added together, had become a wall too high to climb. The worst part was realizing I didn't know exactly when I'd lost the right to be one of us. There was no warning. No frank conversation, just a silent build-up, until the sentence was pronounced with the same casualness as someone commenting on the weather. This made me realize that perhaps I'd been gone for much longer than I'd imagined. And in the midst of all this reflection, something inside me began to shift. The pain didn't lessen, but it gave way to a spark, a drive that told me I couldn't simply accept this as the end. There was still something to do. I spent the night awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant sounds of the house. It was strange to think that, just a few feet away, were the people I'd known forever, but who now treated me like an intruder. Every footstep in the hallway, every door closing, felt like a reminder that I was isolated within my own home. I began to wonder if it was really worth trying to understand the reasons, or if this search would only deepen the wound. Part of me wanted to walk into the kitchen the next day and demand a clear explanation, face to face. Another part knew that if the decision had already been made, any words from me would just be another stone thrown at me. It was then that I remembered how my mother avoided all eye contact when she spoke to me. There was no hesitation, no regret, only certainty. It made me wonder if, perhaps, she was simply saying something the rest of the family already thought. That thought hurt more than any other. Still, I needed answers. I couldn't live with such a huge void, without understanding the exact reason. If I was going to be excluded, I at least wanted to know for what crime I was being tried without defense. This need began to transform into a plan to cope. I glanced at the clock. It was already past 3 a.m. I took a deep breath and promised myself that tomorrow I would have that conversation, no matter what. And deep down, I knew that whatever came of that decision could change everything, forever. The smell of fresh coffee greeted me as I descended the stairs the next morning. The dim light streaming through the kitchen window cast long shadows on the floor. My mother sat at the table, leafing through a newspaper, as if it were just another ordinary day. My father washed the dishes, his movements slow and meticulous. I paused in the doorway, feeling the invisible weight of the atmosphere. She didn't look at me right away, but I noticed the slight stiffening in her hands as she turned the page. I sat at the table, keeping my gaze fixed on her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. My father paused for a moment, dried his hands on the cloth, and left the kitchen without saying a word. His silence spoke louder than any words. My mother calmly closed the newspaper and placed it on the table. Her eyes finally met mine. "Talk about what?" she asked, as if she had no idea what I was referring to. This act only intensified my anger. I didn't want to beat around the bush. I wanted her to admit it. "Yesterday at lunch, you said I no longer belong in this family." The words came out like blades. She didn't look away, but she didn't show any guilt either. "And I stand by what I said," she replied, her voice firm and cool. "Some choices have consequences, and you made yours." My whole body tensed. I wanted to ask what those choices were, but something in her tone told me she wasn't ready to reveal everything. It was as if she were playing a game, controlling the pace of the conversation to throw me even further off balance. A sense of injustice burned in my chest, but at the same time, a dark curiosity began to grow. If she wanted me to leave, she needed a strong reason, and I was willing to find out until the end. "What choices?" I insisted, leaning across the table. She took a deep breath and crossed her arms, as if preparing for a verbal battle. "You've always been different," she began, and the way she said the word made me feel like a flaw. "Lately, you've been making decisions that go against everything this family believes in." I immediately remembered the past few weeks, the times I'd questioned traditions that had never made sense to me, the discussions about family business, where my opinion was dismissed as irrelevant, the conversations about the future, where my plans were seen as threats. Maybe, for them, just being myself was reason enough to exclude me. She continued, "We can't have someone who acts like a stranger living as if they were one of our own. It doesn't work." Her coldness cut deeper than any scream. It wasn't a momentary outburst. It was a calculated verdict. She spoke as if she had made the decision long ago. A lump formed in my throat, but I didn't let my voice shake. "So that's it? I don't have any family anymore?" She looked me up and down, weighing every word she was about to say. "That's up to you. But for us, it's already clear." The coffee grew cold in the mug beside me, and I realized that this moment was a point of no return. If I wanted to fully understand, I would have to seek answers outside that kitchen, perhaps in places where my mother had no control over what I heard. I left the kitchen with heavy steps, feeling the weight of every word I'd just heard. I went upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door, but it felt like the whole house was watching me, as if the walls had ears. I grabbed my phone and began scrolling through old messages, searching for clues. Every conversation with my parents, every exchange with my sister, now sounded different, as if there was a hidden meaning I hadn't noticed before. I opened my laptop and went straight to old folders, family photos, travel records, notes saved on forgotten flash drives. I wanted to understand if there was a specific moment when I began to be seen as an intruder. The more I searched, the more I noticed small gestures of withdrawal, birthdays where my presence didn't seem important, family gatherings where my name was mentioned distantly. I decided I needed an outside perspective. I texted a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months, asking if we could meet up. The response was quick enough not to make me suspicious. "Sure, I think it's time we talk about a few things." The tone of that sentence felt charged with something I couldn't ignore. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark, listening to the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway, unsure if they were real or a figment of my tired mind. The clock read 3:17 a.m. when I realized I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, fueled only by a mixture of anger and a need for answers. I knew that whatever I discovered the next day could completely change the way I viewed my family. But in that moment, there was no longer room for fear, only for the truth, naked and raw, even if it was impossible to accept. The next day, I met my cousin at a discreet cafe in the city center. The smell of strong coffee and fresh bread contrasted with the heavy atmosphere surrounding us. He greeted me with a firm handshake, but his eyes avoided mine, as if preparing to say something he'd rather keep secret. We sat in a secluded corner, away from prying ears. "I knew this was coming," he began, stirring his coffee without actually drinking it. The sentence hit me like a punch. He explained that, in recent months, conversations about me had been circulating among some relatives, and that my mother was at the center of these discussions. "She no longer trusts your choices, and it's more serious than it seems." I asked what he meant by more serious. He paused for a long moment, looked around, and lowered his voice. "Your mother thinks you might harm family matters, things that shouldn't be discussed with outsiders." The way he chose his words made me realize there was something much deeper, and perhaps dangerous, behind my exclusion. As he spoke, I felt my entire body tense. Images began to flash through my mind. Meetings I'd never been invited to, financial decisions that completely excluded me, and looks filled with more than simple disapproval. It was as if I'd lived my entire life surrounded by a second layer of reality, carefully hidden from me. When I left the cafe, the street felt colder than before. Each step I took me away from the life I knew, and closer to a truth I hadn't yet had the courage to face fully. But deep down, I already knew I was about to discover much more than I'd ever expected. My cousin's words wouldn't leave my mind. I returned home feeling as if I were carrying a secret that wasn't mine, but that somehow shaped my entire life. On the way, I began to remember seemingly insignificant moments that now took on a different weight. Doors closing as I approached, conversations that stopped the moment I entered, knowing glances exchanged between my parents and some relatives. It was as if there were an us and a them, and I was on the wrong side of the line. I arrived home late in the afternoon, and the faint light of sunset filtered through the curtains, painting the room with shades of gold and somberness at the same time. My parents weren't home, and the silence of the house seemed to give me permission to explore. I went to my father's office, a place I rarely accessed. The door was unlocked. I entered cautiously, smelling old paper and polished wood. The shelves were filled with labeled folders, but one detail caught my attention. A metal box in the lower corner of the bookcase. It was heavy, with a reinforced zipper, but it was open. Inside, I found envelopes containing documents I didn't recognize, contracts signed by familiar names but linked to companies I'd never heard of. Some pages had my last name at the top, as if my very identity were tied to them. As I leafed through it, a detail gave me chills. A report with my name on it, describing my activities, the places I'd visited, and even the conversations I'd had. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had been watching me for a long time. I quickly closed the box, my heart racing, and returned to my room before anyone arrived. There, sitting on the bed, I realized that exclusion from the family wasn't just about differing opinions or choices. I was seen as a risk, and risks, in certain families, are eliminated. That night, when my father arrived, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I found him in the living room, taking off his coat, and placed myself between him and the stairs. "We need to talk, now." He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and irritation, but didn't try to flee. I sat on the couch and motioned for him to do the same. I showed him one of the copies I'd made of the documents before putting everything back. "What's this? Why is my name on reports like I'm a suspect?" My father was silent for several long seconds, staring at the paper as if deciding whether to lie or tell the truth. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "You don't understand. Certain things need to be protected. And lately, you've been making decisions that could ruin everything." The way he said everything made me realize there was more at stake than just family relationships. It was as if there was an invisible web of interests I'd never noticed. I tried to get more answers, but he frowned and stood. "Some doors can't be opened, and if you try, you'll regret it." The coldness of the implied threat hit me deeper than any shout. I knew he wasn't just speaking out of anger. This was a real warning. As he walked upstairs, I remained alone in the room, clutching the document so tightly my hands trembled. And deep down, I understood I had already crossed the line he wanted to keep me away from. Whatever came next, there would be no going back. The next morning, I woke with the feeling that someone was watching me. The light filtering through the curtains offered no comfort, only a pale glow that made the room feel suffocating. I sat up in bed and realized my cell phone was out of place. I don't remember leaving it on the table, and the screen showed calls I hadn't made. It was as if someone had tried to track what I'd been doing. The threat in my father's words echoed in my head, but something stronger than fear drove me. The need to know. I spent the entire morning thinking about how I could find out more without arousing suspicion. I decided to return to his office when he and my mother left, but this time to look for more than just documents. I wanted to find irrefutable proof of what they were hiding. When the house was empty, I acted quickly. I rummaged through drawers, checked false compartments in the shelves, and found a thin folder hidden beneath a layer of old papers. Inside was a list of names, some familiar and some completely unfamiliar. Beside each name were small notes and dates, as if it were a record of secret meetings. What shocked me most was seeing my name crossed off the list, with the word "removed" written next to it. It was as if I had stopped being part of a plan that had been in the works for a long time. The feeling of betrayal was suffocating, but it also gave me clarity. I wasn't just someone they wanted to exclude. I was someone they needed to exclude. I closed the folder and hid it with me. I wasn't sure exactly what I would do with the information, but one thing was certain. If they saw me as a threat, I would have to act accordingly. That night, I decided to follow my father. I waited until he left, claiming a business meeting, and followed him at a safe distance. The cold bit my face as I walked quickly, hiding in the shadows to avoid being noticed. He entered an old building downtown, with no signs, tall windows, and dim lights. I waited a few minutes before approaching, and found a partially open side door. The inner hallway smelled of mildew and aged wood. I followed the sounds of voices to a large room lit only by a few hanging lamps. Inside, a long table seated about 10 people. I recognized the faces of cousins, distant uncles, and even my mother, who should have been home. Everyone was serious, talking about topics that sounded more like clandestine negotiations than family gatherings. I heard words like protection, contracts, and information leak. Every sentence seemed to confirm that something big and dark was going on, something not to be discussed outside that circle. Suddenly, one of the attendees mentioned my name. "He already knows too much," said a male voice I didn't recognize. A chill ran down my spine. My father nodded, and my mother crossed her arms, as if this were just another formality. I backed away slowly, feeling the floor creak beneath my feet. I walked out of there with my heart pounding, aware that now I wasn't just a stranger to them. I was a target. I walked home feeling numb. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the cold night air cut through my skin like blades. Upon entering, I found my parents sitting in the living room, as if they already knew I'd been there. Their expressions held no surprise, only confirmation that my time of silence was over. "You followed us," my father said, his voice deep and slow, as if each word were a verdict. I didn't answer. I threw the folder on the table, scattering the documents. "So this is what you're hiding? Is this why you want to cut me?" The tension in the air was almost physical, so thick it felt like it weighed down my shoulders. My mother crossed her legs and stared at me with a coldness I'd never seen before. "You don't understand what's at stake. It's not about you. It's about all of us. And if you don't step away, you'll ruin everything." The calm in her voice was more frightening than any scream could have been. I felt my heart race, but I didn't back down. "Maybe I already have, and maybe it's time everyone knows who you really are." My father stood slowly, walking toward me with measured steps. "If you do this, there's no going back. And we're not just talking about no longer being part of the family. We're talking about consequences you're not ready to face." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the clock ticking away. In that moment, I realized the choice was before me. Either I retreat and accept exile in silence, or I advance and destroy what remained of the bonds I once called family. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the memories that connected me to those people. The birthdays, the hugs, the nights spent talking. All of it was mixed with lies, secrets, and manipulation. And suddenly, it became clear. The family I'd idealized no longer existed, perhaps never had. I looked at my mother and saw in her eyes something that felt like a silent warning. I looked at my father and realized he was already prepared for any reaction I might make, including destroying me if necessary. And that's when I understood that my survival depended on acting intelligently, not impulsively. I took the documents back, calmly putting them in my backpack. "You're right. I don't belong to this family anymore, but don't think that'll stop me from telling you my side of the story." They didn't answer, just followed me with their eyes as I walked to the door. Each step toward the exit was accompanied by a suffocating silence. It felt like, by walking through that door, I wasn't just leaving the house. I was closing forever the part of my life where I believed blood meant loyalty. When the door closed behind me, I felt a deep chill, but also a strange sense of freedom. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face the world without needing their approval. The night was freezing when I closed the door behind me. The wind bit my face, but the chill I felt came from within. I walked down the deserted street, each step resounding like a hammer hammering the end of an era. There was no going back. That place where I grew up, where I was a child, where I imagined a safe haven, was now just a brick building housing people willing to erase me from their own history. The backpack weighed on my back, not because of what I physically carried, but because of the meaning of what was inside. Those documents were more than papers. They were proof that I never belonged the way I imagined. They were a map of secrets, interests, and alliances that had nothing to do with love or family unity. And, as much as it hurt, I knew it was better to see the truth than to live in the comfort of a lie. I walked to the central square, where I sat on a bench under a dim streetlight. I watched the people hurry past, carrying bags, laughing, living their lives unaware of me or the storm I carried within me. Freedom tasted bitter that night. I could go wherever I wanted, do whatever I wanted, but along with that freedom came the knowledge that I was alone, and perhaps more vulnerable than ever. I spent hours there, thinking about every moment that had brought me here. I remembered the times I'd defended my family, even when I knew they were wrong, the times I'd swallowed words to avoid arguments, believing silence was the bridge that would keep us together. Now I realized that, for them, I'd never really been on the same side. I'd been useful as long as I followed the rules. The moment I questioned them, I became disposable. I rose with a clear goal, to use what I knew, not for revenge, but because I deserved my own narrative. I would not allow my story to be told only through the mouths of those who betrayed me. I walked back home, not to theirs, but to the small apartment I had in the city. It was my space, the only place I could breathe without fear of judgmental stares or veiled threats. As I closed the apartment door, I felt the silence embrace me in a different way. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of rebuilding. I knew the road ahead would be long, full of obstacles and perhaps dangers, but this time, I would be ready. If they had taught me anything, it was that survival also means knowing when to cut ties. And that night, I cut the last one. If this story made you reflect, share it, so more people understand that true family isn't just about blood, but also loyalty and respect. Subscribe to the channel, send this video on WhatsApp, and comment where you're watching from. I read every comment and want to know how far this story has come.